Hello, hello, hello.
Hello. Hello, humans. You're listening to The Great Everything.
The Great Everything.
An exploration into the stuff that makes us human. To the ideas, stories, and culture that make humanity great. You're listening to The Great Everything. A conversation about becoming a better human.
Hello. I am calling in response to your segment here, and so much of what you just said resonates with me.
Doesn't it feel sometimes like life is a treadmill that's kind of going too fast, running away from us?
Brilliant thought process as usual.
I don't really have very optimistic views of the world, but I like listening to your station.
But the thing about treadmills is, although you're struggling to catch up, you're always staying still. Hello humans, welcome back to The Great Everything, an exploration into culture, ethics, and our quest to become better humans. I'm Patrick, a former banking lawyer who saw the light and quit to dedicate my life to culture and philosophy. So I'd like to talk more about art today, and I'd like to move away from the conversation we had last time about whether art should ever be judged based on the moral character of the artist. And my answer, at least in that case and for the time being, was absolutely not. Now I'd like to ask a broader, more general question, but perhaps a more interesting one. And that is, what is art? How do you define art? How would you categorize art in a way where you are confident that your definition includes all instances of things that you would consider art, but also excludes all instances of things that you would not consider art? So this isn't a random question. It was prompted by a conversation I had last night. I had a wonderful night out with my friend Daniele and two ladies we recently met who are also artists. We went to see Chopin, Les Etudes, a lovely classical music concert. And after the concert, we went for dinner. And because of the occupation of the two ladies we were with, and because of my interest in all things artistic, the conversation ended up on Duchamp, a name that some of you will be familiar with. He's a very famous artist from the 20th century, but most of you will be familiar, if not with the artist, with his most famous artwork, which is The Fountain. The Fountain is a urinal. That's all it is. It is a urinal. And it's one of the first examples, if not the very first example, of art as installation. It was simply a urinal installed there with the heading Fountain. Now, the question is, was this art? This isn't my question. This was a question that was raised at the time by critics, by the public, and by the artist himself, whose specific aim was to prompt that conversation about what art was. He wanted to move art away from the concept of beauty. Now, that is an interesting move, because we all have our own definition of things. I have a definition of art, and I think it's rather canonical. My definition of art isn't of something that is trying to be beautiful, but it is something that is in relation to beauty. Let me explain. Now, art has to be a visual medium, right? It has to be seen. Fine. The fountain, the urinal, that is also visual. You don't get the message of moving away from beauty if you don't see it. I guess you could touch it if you were blind, but ultimately it's still a visual medium. Fine. But to me, art has always been about being in a relationship with the concept of beauty. That doesn't mean that all art has to aspire to be beautiful, although that has often been the case. I would say that even where art has aspired to do the very opposite, to be ugly, to be disturbing, it is still engaging with the concept of beauty. It is still defining itself in opposition to beauty. It is trying to be ugly, which is just the opposite side of beauty. In other words, it is engaging with aesthetics, whether beautiful or ugly. It is asking the question, or making us ask the question, is this beautiful? Is this not beautiful? And I think that if you're moving away from the concept of art as beauty, well, then you are just moving away from art. Perhaps you are doing something that isn't art. But that's just my personal opinion. The example I had yesterday at dinner was, imagine a musician who cuts a track, and the track is merely the musician saying, this is music. And the justification is, well, this is audio, it's still sound waves, you're still hearing it, just like the urinal is visual. But I'm trying to move music away from rhythm, melody, beat, harmony, and make it just anything that is audio, anything that is a sound. So it doesn't matter whether it's Beethoven's Ninth Symphony or a thunderous fart. If it's audio, it's music. Very well. Interesting concept. But by doing so, aren't you moving away from the very thing that makes it music? In other words, by moving art away from an engagement with beauty, aren't we kind of just doing away with the concept of categories and definitions to start with? I mean, you might say we don't need categories. Maybe we don't need definitions. I would argue that we do need them to communicate. But this is a very interesting question, and I'd like to hear your voice on. What is art? And do we need categories? I hope you enjoyed that rather provocative inclusion of John Cage's 433, which is of course a similar statement that John Cage was making to the one Duchamp was making with his masterwork Fountain, which is just a urinal. He's saying, well, you know what? Art isn't just stuff that is trying to be beautiful. Art has nothing to do with beauty, not necessarily. And John Cage is saying with 4 minutes 33, well, silence can be music. I happen to disagree. I think it's an interesting concept, it's an interesting message, it's an interesting philosophy even, but I don't think it's music. But anyway, that's just my personal opinion. I think this question of how we define things raises an even more interesting question, although a slightly more complicated one, on what categories are and whether we need them, and if we do, why. Because of course, if you are moving art away from the very definition of what makes it art, you are trying to ignore or dispense with the, almost you might call it, foundational characteristic of what makes it what it is, of what fits it within that category that we call art, then perhaps what is implicit here is a broader statement that we are trying to do away with the very concept of categories, of distinctions between things. And I think that that is a very interesting concept, fascinating concept. What are categories? Well, I suppose categories are not something that exists in the real world. We know that ultimately different items, different individual items, share a number of qualities and characteristics with other individual items, but that no two items are identical, right? No two items are equal to one another. They might be so similar as to appear identical, but two things cannot be the same thing. That is merely a matter of logic and also physics. So categories are mainly just a linguistic convention for us to be able to effectively communicate with one another, to be able to talk about things that are not currently present within our visual field, right? Without the category of, say, cats, I could never tell you anything about cats generally without pointing to Golda right here on my bed. So I wouldn't be able to say cats are furry, quite cute, cuddly, clawed creatures that occasionally annoy you and fart often, frequently when their arse is turned towards your face so that they can show you who's boss. And I couldn't do that without actually pointing at a cat there presently. The category of cats is merely a convention of animals that share certain characteristics, none two of which are identical, but which we can then define as this broad category of cats, so that we ease communication about things that fall broadly within that category. So the category helps us to differentiate things from things that are sufficiently different so that they don't fall under the umbrella term. By doing away with categories, we are doing away with a very important and fundamental and necessary linguistic convention. But it's not all bad. Yesterday, one of the ladies I was talking to, a girl called, she's a poet, and she makes music as well. She does a thing called poetronica. She's very talented, and she was talking about how she doesn't know how to categorize what she does, and she wasn't being arrogant about it. She was simply saying that, look, when I try to categorize it, I feel constrained by having to limit myself to the conventions of whatever category, whatever genre I'm restricting myself to. But when I stop thinking about it in terms of categories, I feel freer, I feel that flow, I'm in the zone, and I'm free to express myself creatively, and I don't know what to call what comes out, Maybe I can label it after it's done. But freeing myself of the convention of the category actually allows me to create artistically. And I think that's a very powerful point. So there is an interesting dichotomy here between the necessity of categories, of labels, but also an acknowledgement that they can be very, very restrictive. They can limit the way we talk about the world by restricting things into these very narrow confines. And B, also the fact that when we use categories and labels and definitions, we need to always be aware that at the margins of each definition, there is certainly scope for a whole lot of flexibility.
Hello, the great everything. This is Lane from Pure Beast Nation. I just wanted to stop by to say thank you for the great topics and hitting that topic about removing culture for the campaign Me Too. I'm really enjoying it. Keep up the good work.
Hey Patrick, so I read the Guardian article and others about the temporary removal of Hylas and the nymphs. I don't see the temporary removal of the postcards and the painting as a bad thing. I see this as like an art installation. They've given people who come to the museum an opportunity to leave notes, to add their pieces of the conversation. These are topics that have often been pushed to the recesses of society or of standard conversation. So to bring them to the forefront into a safe environment and allow them to be fostered in a place where culture and art is celebrated, I think is another celebration, another opportunity to evaluate and reflect on our culture.
Hey, thanks for the call in. And I think you raise a very valid point. It's certainly an interesting perspective. And I don't disagree with you. I think the issue here is that we might be having two conversations that are somewhat similar, but also slightly different. We're looking at it from different perspectives, perhaps. Here's what I mean. I agree with you on a couple of things. I agree with you, for instance, on the intention of the museum in Manchester when they removed their famous piece of artwork by Waterhouse. I don't think that they wanted to censor. I don't think that that is their intention. They said it wasn't their intention. I absolutely know for certain that no museum on earth would want to cut its grant money and funding from the UK government by removing perhaps its most beloved piece of artwork, its most beloved and famous piece of art. So, yes, I agree that they probably didn't mean to censor. I also agree, although somewhat less, with the idea that what they're trying to do is look at a piece of art or prompt discussion about a piece of art in light of the shifting social circumstances. The word that gets bandied about is recontextualization. This is a word that makes me cringe every time, because every time you see the word recontextualization, you know it's going to be some PC bullshit coming our way. Sorry PC people, but I do think that a lot of it is just absolute crap and nonsense. But anyway, recontextualization, I kind of get it. I get the idea of relating a piece of antique artwork or writing or the behaviors of some famous historical character and looking at it in the light of today's society and culture and trying to elucidate new things about ourselves and about the thing in the past that we are studying. I find that that's a worthy endeavor. It's not as important, I think, as people would have us believe, because ultimately what really matters with art and literature and historical moments is their context, not our context. The thing that matters about Louis Armstrong rather, is how important he was when he came about. If Louis Armstrong came around today, he'd be a very talented trumpeter, but nothing that we haven't heard a billion times. However, back in 1921, he was the most important musician who had ever lived up to that point. So context really matters. If you look at Louis Armstrong's music in the context of today, he's a really decent Dixieland cover band player. Like, what is that? The context the original context is perhaps what matters the most. I'm not saying that that means recontextualization is useless. I think it's interesting. But the problem is that when you see the word recontextualization used in any context, it usually implies, in fact, I'll say it almost always implies, a judgment, an appraisal of the artwork being considered in light of today's moral standards. And usually it is a harsh and negative judgment. And that is something, the judgment of something from the past according to today's moral standards, I find it absolutely absurd. I find it to be a philosophical nonsensity. So, I understand the whole recontextualization, although I don't always agree with it. I understand they didn't want to censor, but ultimately they did censor. In the sense that, okay, they wanted to prompt a conversation, fine, but they did it very lazily. They did it by playing into the current culture of censorship, one where the prevailing notion of the right thing to do, when we don't like something, we don't like an idea, we don't like a piece of art, we don't like what something that someone says, the best thing to do isn't to argue against it with logic and reason and have a dialogue, but to make it a taboo, to make it something that should be removed, to make it an idea that shouldn't be spoken, to not let the speaker have a platform, to deplatform, I think is the word people use, to ban the book, to stop the publisher from publishing it, to removing the piece of artwork. So there is a culture of censorship that is growing, I think. And by choosing this method, this let's not call it censorship, let's call it removing the piece of artwork that is the one that is trying to prompt the conversation, well, perhaps you're not explicitly censoring, but you're certainly playing into the culture of censorship through laziness. Yes, we're back with The Great Everything, a place to discuss everything, except anything I'm not particularly interested in. And we're continuing this conversation about art, trying to find answers to the question, what is art? Or if we can't find answers, at least find better questions. But I also want to delve deeper into this notion of categories. What are categories? Do they actually exist? Or rather, as I think, are they merely tools that we use to conceptualize the world around us, to make sense of it, to navigate it, and also then to communicate about that world? And I think we need to be paying attention to this. This is very important, because this is something we all do, right? Applying labels, applying categories and distinctions between discrete things. We have to do it. We couldn't not do it. It's about evolution, right? We are descended from creatures who are very good at applying categories between different things and telling the difference between what was useful for survival and what wasn't. I mean, if you can't tell the difference between fire and water, you're going to have trouble drinking, right? We've descended from the ones who could tell the difference and understood that water is drinkable and fire isn't. The ones who were drinking the fire, they really got fucked up. They didn't have kids. So here's the thing. We need to be able to do this. We need to label things. We need to categorize things. But we need to be wary of when we do this and how we do it. We need to understand this mechanism. Because when we're applying labels, when we're setting up these distinctions, these categories, we are imposing structure upon a world that might not have any structure at all, let alone the kinds of structures that we're trying to impose upon it. What I mean here is that there's, at least a very good argument that ultimate reality, and we're in metaphysics here, might not even be made up of objects, of discrete things, but rather is made up of continuum, of processes. Everything's just on a continuum. There's no real boundaries between things. Kind of like Heraclitus said, that everything flows. Pantare. He's the you can't step in the same river twice guy, Greek philosopher. So the ultimate reality might not even have a structure, yet we impose structure upon reality around us to be able to navigate it. But also discuss about it, have communication about it, effectively enter into dialogue about different things and about the world itself. We need to be doing this, and we need to be careful about how we do this. Here's what I mean. It's quite clear that we live in a subjective universe, in the sense that every one of us has an individual point of view that is subjective, and that is perhaps similar but ultimately different from any other individual point of view, right? And that is more apparent now than ever, because now we're in contact, in communication, thanks to globalization and social media. We're in communication with all these different points of view. We're coming into well, we could say interaction with them, but sometimes even conflict. And yet, all of these different points of view, they impose their own structure, their own narrative upon the world around them. They have a whole different set of characters, right? They have their own movie they're in, right? And every movie is slightly different. There's similarities, but they're ultimately different. So we need to understand that when we communicate, we might be using the same words, we might be using the same concepts, but that ultimately to each of us, they mean something slightly different. So we need to be able to understand that we are communicating between narratives, to understand the language that other people are using, and that it is probably not the same one we are using. So that's why I think focusing on categories and how to define things effectively in communication is very important, to avoid assuming that the categories, the words that people are using about certain categories are the same that you are using, that perhaps when you are using the same word, you are actually referring to different categories. You're actually referring to different narratives. That maybe someone who in someone else's story is a villain, in your story is a good guy, and that can be applied to almost anything around you, from this ironing board to a bottle of whiskey to my cat here on the table looking at me like, what's he going on about, to literally everything around us. But anyway, that said, some call-ins.
Hi Patrick, I was listening to your segment on art and I found it very interesting. I remember hearing about that piece 433, and the explanation was that the music was to be interpreted as the ambient sounds. I don't know if that makes it more artistic or more musical, but it reminds me of another piece that's maybe a little more deliberate, and that was Glenn Gould's The Idea of North. And he interviewed a bunch of people in northern Ontario, I think, and he took their conversations and spliced them and overlaid them, and sometimes they overlap, sometimes it's cacophonous, and sometimes fades in and fades out. And I'm wondering if that would be considered a little more musical, especially given who it's coming from. And I don't know as much about counterpoint as he does, but I'm pretty sure that all of his splices and edits were very deliberate. And
Hey Ron, thanks for the correction there. I do believe you're right, that John Cage's intention with the piece 433 was for the audience to focus on the ambient noise and not the silence. Though I don't think that this really affects my own personal opinion on whether 433 is music or not, because whether John Cage wanted to elevate silence or ambient noise to the status of music, I still think he is stepping beyond the boundaries of how I define music. And this is the point. I'm not particularly interested in trying to determine whether any individual piece of art or music is indeed art or music. What I'm interested in is how we define things, the method of coming up with definitions and then deciding what delineates certain categories from others and communicating about those delineations and those definitions. So my personal reaction, my personal answer to your question, do you think Glenn Gould's project is music? I would say, well, probably not, but the question that is perhaps more interesting to me is, well, how do you define music? Because really, whether it's music or not depends on how you define music. My definition of music, as I mentioned, is something that contains, well, it's audio. It has to be sound, right? And it has to come in through your ears. And it has to be organized. And it has to be, well, intentionally organized. It can't just be random sounds. And these random sounds have to include some kind of combination of rhythm, melody, harmony, Not all of them necessarily. I do think that just a guy beating on a drum, with some kind of structure is music, or can be music. But there needs to be some element there of rhythm, punctuation, intervals of time between various notes, harmony, melody. And that is just my definition of music. But I think that that really does encapsulate what the overwhelming majority of people would intuitively agree just is music. You listen to something, you say, well, that's music. And then you listen to traffic, you think that's not music. Now, that doesn't mean I don't appreciate what is being done with 433 or by Glenn Gould or by Duchamp when he's, with his fountain, his urinal piece. Because although I don't agree that any of those individual pieces fits within my definition of the form that they want to be a part of, art or music, I do think that it is an artist's, well, I would say almost a duty for a great artist to push the boundaries of those categories and to ask those questions. What is art? Is this art? And to force those conversations. I think that's very important, even if I might not agree with the new definition that they're trying to bring in, or in the direction in which they're willing to expand the existing definition. So I'll always be grateful for the intellectual exercise and artistic exercise even of these great visionary minds who want to push the boundaries. But I do think that the kind of conversation that this pushing of boundaries should prompt is one about how we categorize things. So I suppose the question that I find interesting from you isn't really, is Glenn Gould's piece music? But it's, how do you define music?
Good day, Patrick. I think what describes art is derived completely from intent and purpose of what the artist is making, creating, or doing. Let's say, for example, somebody has a rock and they decide to bust this rock up with a hammer and create tons of tiny little pieces that they organize into a structure or form or shape. That right there can, and I would consider to be art. The problem that lies is that we need categories. We need categories to describe what this art is, so that we cannot, hold the same expectations of a, surrealist or realist painting compared to a pile of rocks, or, for lack of better words, just something that was less effort than those paintings. I think that categories are necessary, but I think that the rocks could be considered art.
Hey Galen, some interesting points there. And I think I agree that for something to constitute art, there needs to be some kind of intention there. Which means that I also agree that at least potentially, the example you made, the splintered rock, could constitute art, especially if the intention in splintering the rock was artistic. But then that really raises another big question, and that is if all it takes for art to be created is an artistic intention. Is talent not a factor? So what if your intention is to create art, but because you lack talent, it's just not art? So does it have to be good to be art? That's a really interesting question, I think. And it's, so much of subjectivity comes into play here. What is talent? Who gets to decide if you are talented? What if you're someone who doesn't adhere to acceptable norms of artistic canons, and they are only discovered to be visionary artists way after their time has passed? So there's a lot coming into play here. I think you raised some very interesting points that we're definitely going to explore further. In fact, we're going to explore them right now.
Hey Patrick, David Jones here. I'm going to be trying to be as quick as possible. So I was thinking about a response in terms of the question, what is art? And I came up with a couple of responses because I revised one, but it made an interesting point, which is probably worth discussing. So straight into it, what is art? I had it down. I had it in my mind as a composition whose purpose by design is to provoke or summon an emotional response in the person or persons who experience it. Composition being, not just music, but words, images, moving images, etc. I then decided to change it because there is such thing, I think, as accidental art, to a composition whose impression, whether by design or not, summons an emotional response in the person or persons who experience it. Because I think that some things can be considered art even if they weren't supposed to be.
Davy Jones, welcome to The Great Everything. Great to hear from you, man. So, guys, Davy's actually a very old friend, someone whose voice I haven't heard in something like 15 years, I guess. We used to go to college together. In my first year of university, we were living in the same apartment block. I remember long chats about music we used to have. Then, as is always the case, or usually at least, we fell out of touch for a decade or so. Until last week, Davy reached out, got in touch. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that was prompted by The Great Everything, which I thought was really cool. It was like literally The Great Everything bringing people together. So that's awesome. Thank you, Davy. And I think your definition of art is very interesting. Let's just remind listeners. Davy defines art as a composition whose purpose it is, by design, to provoke an emotional response in the experiencer. And Davy separately got in touch with me to clarify that it has to be a man-made composition, so that way we can exclude nature stuff, like the Northern Lights or the Grand Canyon, which also elicit a whole intense emotional response, but they're not doing so on purpose. They're not doing it by design. So let's start by acknowledging that Davy is going for a much broader conception of art than my own. So I was thinking more about visual art, anything from the Sistine Chapel to Picasso. But there is also that broader conception which Davy is going for, which makes sense, right? We're talking about art, capital A, in a way that includes film, music, literature, maybe fashion, and other stuff like that. Compositions. So poetry, right? Poetry, man-made composition that is there to elicit an emotional response. So that is art. But if we're going to go with this definition of composition that wants to elicit an emotional response, I think we need to be more specific at what we mean by composition. Let me explain. So, what is a composition? Is, for instance, an item of jewelry a composition? I would say it probably is, according to my definition of composition. It is composed, it is put together with intent. And think of a wedding ring, a little diamond ring, right? A guy pulls it out of his pocket, opens the little box, gets down on a knee in front of a woman or a confused young man, and he proposes. And that is certainly there, that ring, to elicit that emotional response. And the person who designed the wedding ring knew that. Is that art? Would you say that photos of kittens on the internet are art? Photographs are certainly compositions, right? They are compositions, and they are definitely there, the ones about kittens, to provoke an emotional response. Is it art? Am I creating art when I'm photographing Golda and posting it on Facebook? I think probably we'd agree that that's not art. So perhaps something is missing here, either in the definition of composition or broadly in the definition of art. And maybe that something is that there has to be an artistic intention, which is what the previous caller said when he was talking about the guy who breaks the rock and splinters it, but his intention is to create art. But then that raises a question. What does it mean to have an artistic intention? Is it to elicit that emotional response? But what if some art is just trying to elicit an intellectual response and titillate you that way? Is that not art? I think whether it's emotional or intellectual, I think what is ultimately missing from your definition, Davy, for it to satisfy me, that is the aesthetic element. Like the idea of beauty. Again, it doesn't have to be trying to be beautiful, but I think for it to be art, it needs to be trying to enter into some kind of dialogue with the idea of beauty. Except, maybe I don't think that that's necessarily the case, because, you know what, thinking again about Duchamp's The Fountain, I was thinking about Magritte's painting, Ceci n'est pas une pipe, as the treachery of images. So that painting is there to relay a message. It's saying, this is not a pipe, but it's a painting of a pipe. So the message there is that, the map is not the territory kind thing. The representation is not the thing. This is not a pipe. It is just an image of the pipe. Is that painting trying to be beautiful? Or is it engaging in an idea of aesthetics at all? I don't know. I think that you could argue that there is no sense of aesthetics there, apart from the fact that it's a nice painting of a pipe. So I wonder if aesthetics is necessary. It's a very interesting thing to ponder. But anyway, you raise another very interesting point regarding intention about accidental art that I want to explore more. Davey raises a very interesting notion in his call-in about this idea of accidental art. So objects or items that we might consider as art today, but that weren't necessarily designed to be artistic when they were created. So Davey also got in touch with me separately to clarify and expand on this. And he's talking about, quote, really old tools, for example, ones which are now pretty much obsolete, things which for some reason my dad would clean and put on display in our house. They do have some sort of beauty to them, and I find myself looking at these objects like I would look at a painting or sculpture. And I have to admit, I don't even know what some of them are even for, but they do make me feel things looking at them, purely as objects, with their polished brass fittings, grooves where fingers once gripped, a well-used but now useless object. But this honesty, I think, is probably the source of where this appreciation of mundane objects comes from. Objects which had no pretense when created of being anything other than a tool, gain something when their usefulness becomes obsolete. Whereas such things weren't created to be art, they can be, and frequently are, appreciated as art, in that they have a certain honest beauty to them. Unquote. So, there's a lot there to digest, and I think Davey really hit the nail on the head when he's talking about our mundane appreciation for these kind of objects. So I don't know if any of you has ever read my article on thegreateverything.com, Art, Donuts and Transformation. And in that article, but also the episode I did on the podcast, I went on a little detour about what I consider to be the most convincing theory on where our appreciation for man-made beauty comes from. So we're talking, of course, about artifacts that were made by men and that we find beautiful. And we do have this as part of our sort of cultural evolution, that we do find certain things beautiful. And the late Dennis Dutton, a professor of aesthetics, he has this idea that is all about the hand axes, those little carving tools that we find around Ethiopia starting 1.5 million years ago. Homo erectus used to make these. And we have so many of them that we know that there was a real cultural move towards making these hand axes. And they would have been used, for hunting, for butchering, for skinning goats or whatever it is you skin. I've never skinned anything. But here's the thing. There's so many of these hand axes, and so many of them show no sign of wear and tear, that there's a real question as to what they were being used for. So if these hand axes weren't being used for hunting or butchering, why were so many of them made? So I'm going to read you a quote from my article here. The answer may have something to do with bumping uglies. Much like a peacock's tail, a finely made hand axe served as a useful indicator of desirable sexual qualities such as intelligence, fine motor control, and planning ability, giving its maker a reproductive advantage over his less dexterous peers. Gradually, these practical tools were transformed into captivating aesthetic objects, contemplated both for their elegant shape and their virtuoso craftsmanship. From the prehistoric gadgets to the Sistine Chapel, we have evolved to admire works of great skill. In the words of Dutton, quote, "We find beauty in something done well." End quote, generally. So I think that relates to what Davey was saying. We do have an appreciation for mundane objects, and I think that let's move it away from a discussion about art, but I think what we need to be noticing here is skill. The idea that we do appreciate things that are made with design and that have some kind of purpose. We enjoy seeing things done well. And whether that's about beauty or about usefulness, well, that really does increase our appreciation, the fact that there's an intentionality behind it. Now, as far as the use is concerned, I'm not sure why you would be looking at these objects that your dad displays with such fascination as objects of beauty, but I venture this. These old objects, even the ones where you don't know what they were for, they offer us a window into people who are very similar to us, but at the same time, because of context, also very different. That's the kind of feeling I get when I read the works of Cicero, for instance. I realize that I'm looking into the mind of someone who was human. His biology was the same as mine, but the cultural circumstances made him very different. And I venture that maybe looking at these old objects has that emotional response because it opens up a whole new world. It's time to wrap up our 2-day-long conversation about defining art. At the end of all this, what is art? I gotta say, I got some pretty good ideas from you guys. So is art a composition that tries to summon some kind of response, whether intellectual or emotional? And if so, what would that make the type of tearjerker photography that you find on the covers of papers? Are those art? I'm thinking about things like the photo of the drowned Syrian boy on the beach. Is that art? It's certainly trying to elicit an emotional response. What about romantic comedies like Notting Hill? Are those art? Or my earlier example, the cute kitten videos on YouTube. Are those art? Or must there also be, for it to be art, some aesthetic intention there? The intention to enter into a relationship with beauty, whether that means trying to create something beautiful, or maybe just saying something about beauty by intentionally being not beautiful. And if so, what do we make of Magritte's pipe painting? Which isn't really trying to be beautiful as much as it's trying to convey a message about images and representation and reality. Ceci n'est pas une pipe. This is not a pipe. Obviously, it's a picture of a pipe. And there's a difference, and Magritte wants you to pay attention to that difference. That's the point. Yet, we intuitively feel that this painting is art. But if Magritte's pipe is art, why not Duchamp's fountain, the piece of work that I started this show by saying I don't think that's art? Why is it different from Magritte's pipe, other than the fact that one is a painting and the other one's a urinal? I mean, that too isn't trying to be aesthetic, it's merely trying to make a point about art. So could it be that this is what we need for it to be art, this trying to say something, trying to make a point? Davey, who called in earlier, he got back in touch and said, the cute kitten pics, they're not art because there's no message there. There's no attempt to say anything about the object of the art or the artist, other than just to represent it. Here, there's a kitten. But now, this is getting into difficult territory, because then what do we make of all these artists from the 16th century onwards? The ones obsessed with still life painting. Paintings of grapes and fruit and stuff like that. What are they trying to say? And if it's the trying to say something that makes one an artist, is a philosopher an artist? Take me, I'm obviously not a philosopher, but everything I do here on Anchor is me trying to say something. Am I an artist? Is it my intention that might make me an artist? Perhaps, but then does that mean that old things that weren't designed to be art can't be appreciated as art by later generations looking back on them? Is it just context that makes something art? So here's something I've been playing around with in my mind since we started this conversation. And let's go back to the original question. What is art? The way I think people hear that question, and to be fair, the way I asked it kind of wants you to answer it like this. Art is anything that has these qualities. Art is an object that does this. What do you notice here? Well, that we're not actually defining art. We're just defining what an object has to be for it to fit within the category of art. We're not defining art, we're just listing entry requirements. But what about art itself, the category of art? What is actual art? What's this thing that we talk about when we mention art? Try this on for size. Art is an idea. It's an aspiration. It's what animates us to express something about ourselves or the world, but where how we express it is an integral part of what we're trying to express. Art might be saying something, and the way we say it is just as interesting, if not more interesting, than what is being said. And it's not necessarily constrained by the normal limits of communication either. Art is a concept, the borders of which are vague and fuzzy, and some of it is in the intention of the creator, and some of it is in the reaction of the audience. But it's an idea that we can all contribute to, both as artists, and as critics, and as audience. So perhaps what I'm trying to say is, art is a conversation. And maybe it's a conversation you're having just with yourself in your head, or maybe it's a conversation that you're having with all the other artists that have come before you. But it's a conversation about something. And I think that maybe that something is, how do we express ourselves, our world, our humanity, in a way that reaches people and that transcends the restrictions of normal means of communication? How do we do that? And who's good at doing that? As I said earlier, there's no answers here, only more questions. Hopefully better questions. But after all this, I know that I've at least come to a place where I can change my mind and say, yeah, Duchamp's fountain, maybe it's art, maybe it's not. But I know I probably wouldn't piss in it.
Patrick, there's a little town called Mexican Hat, Utah, which sits just outside of Monument Valley. It's on the San Juan River. I guess they do some kind of river rafting trips down that river at various points in time. In that little town, there was a restaurant, and on the wall there was a sign that says Chicago 1455, New York 2203, Los Angeles 451, and then underneath that is a shadow box full of all kinds of really old tools, like some really bizarre looking wrenches, a twisted hammer that looks like it was actually made out of maybe a lug wrench, some kind of a really bizarre looking screwdriver, and a fork tool that you pound on to separate bearings, I think. Art, oftentimes, I believe, has everything to do with where it is and how well it fits into the space. In this little cafe that sits on the side of a small road, this art that makes up the walls of the entire restaurant with all of the old pictures that go along with all of the really unique art that decorates the little cafe is most appropriate. Old signs about car service, and oil cans, and all kinds of stuff like that, right? Kind of like you might expect to see an old two-man saw with a scene painted on it in a restaurant, in a lodge somewhere. Art in a shadow box.
Hello mortals, I hope you enjoyed this last episode of The Great Everything as much as I enjoyed making it. And if you did, I'd like to ask for your help for a second. Don't run off, it's nothing really. As you know, I put in quite a lot of thought and time and effort into bringing you this fresh content every day, and I'll always do that as long as I have the energy and the time, and I'll always do it for free, because to me it's a great privilege and a pleasure to be able to pick up my phone, switch on Anchor, and talk into my phone in a way where some of you can extract value out of that. It fills me with a sense of deep gratitude to think that there are so many of you who listen to the nonsense I have to say and use it to, make your day just a tiny bit better. That is a feeling I honestly was not prepared for, and that I don't think I'll ever get used to, and I'd like to thank you for that. And in exchange for that, I will always be bringing you this stuff and these thoughts and perhaps a tiny bit of culture or philosophy to make your day or life better, hopefully. But there are two ways you can help me keep doing this. The first, and perhaps the most important to me personally, in a non-cynical way, is contribution. By contribution, I don't mean money. Let me just say that to start. Not money, never money. If it were about money to me, then I still would be a banking lawyer in London on a 6-figure salary. I turn my back on that precisely because money isn't the most important thing. No, by contribution, I actually mean contributing to the show. That means calling in, or if you don't want to call in, you can just get in touch with me on social media, at The Great Everything, on Twitter, at TGE Blog, or on Facebook, or any other way, maybe even on Anchor, to suggest ideas, to suggest things that you'd like me to talk about, to ask questions, to give me topics that you'd like to see me tackle on The Great Everything, or suggest people that you know on Anchor or elsewhere that you think could have a fruitful conversation with me. Basically, what would you like to hear here? What would you like to hear less of? And I will think about that and hopefully give you what you want, especially if it fits within the directions I'd like to take this. You are a part of this show. This show is a conversation. So you can help me and the show by being part of the conversation any way you like. The second way you can help me is, of course, sharing. Now, this is the more cynical aspect, and I never feel comfortable asking for this, but I understand that there are mechanics to how these things work. And I'm hoping that having given up my job and then having given up my scholarship to come help my mother out with her health, now I can try and make Anchor and this podcast, The Great Everything, my means of survival. And it has been going very well. I have thousands of you following me on Anchor, but I think we need to push it a bit more. Now, if you'd like to see me get into the, medium big leagues, you can do that by sharing my content. You can do it by adding me on Twitter or Instagram or anywhere else and just talking about us. I'll never be asking you for money. That will never, ever happen. But a share, an echo, and a like on Facebook, a follow on Twitter, that means everything. So, having said that, I'll catch you around on the next episode of The Great Everything. And thank you.